Hello, everyone. Welcome to our participants who are on site and online. It's lovely to see everyone gathered to discuss such an important topic. So my name is Sharmila. I am co-convening this event with Niina. Both of us work at LSE. This event is funded by the Sociological Review Foundation as part of their seminar series. I'd also like to thank the LSE Gender Studies Department and the LSE European Institute for co-hosting the event. So what was our motivation for putting this together and bringing all of you here? So often sex workers are represented as targets of care, and this is something we see in our own work, usually in the form of interventions such as rescue and moral repair. And in this symposium, we aim to rethink care in relation to sex work in a range of ways. We want to explore the boundaries between care and control in the dominant political thinking on sex work. We want to probe interventions that center a framework of care within sectors such as anti-trafficking, migration, or even digital spaces. We also reimagine sexual labor in the context of care work and social reproduction more broadly. We will be thinking about care as a potentially transformative and disruptive practice and examine how sex workers, who are often excluded from traditional infrastructures of care, can point to new ways of arranging social relations that provide alternatives to our current understandings of solidarity and care. For example, through mutual aid, harm reduction, and organizing other support networks. Keeping in mind that sex workers are an over-researched but underrepresented population in academia, and the various ethical and methodological issues involved in sex work research, we are also asking how an ethics of care could be formulated in research practice and what it might look like in different contexts. Recognizing that this is a complicated and tricky conversation, we also wish to reflect on the ways in which we talk about sex work and care, including grappling with and navigating the risks of framing sex work as caring labor and the multiple scales and registers of these conversations. And we are really looking forward to doing all of that in the next day and a half with all of you. So just some housekeeping reminders before I turn over to the keynote panel. One is, let's all be nice and respectful to each other. Everyone here is engaging in good faith, and everyone here does have a history of, working very carefully and thoroughly in sex work research. So let's have healthy, productive conversations. That's one. Two, if you are joining us online, you can either type your questions in the chat or write down the word question. And at the end of the speeches of everyone in the panel, we'll call on you. And obviously, if you need anything, it's just either, if you're online, message Niina or myself, or if you're on site, just grab us and have a chat with us. I think that's everything. So if we don't have any further questions, I would like to turn over to our keynote panel. I'm very grateful to all of them for joining us. Chairing this panel is Dr. Simanti Dasgupta, who is an associate professor of anthropology at the University of Dayton and currently a fellow at the International Institute for Asian Studies in Leiden University. So she's come all the way to join us, and I'm really, really thankful. Have you here, Simanti? So turn over to Simanti.
Welcome, everyone. Very happy to be here, and thanks to Niina and Sharmila for organizing such a fantastic event. We will follow the program as it is listed. So we'll start with Dr. Julia O'Connell Davidson, followed by Prabha and Kotiswaran, and then the English collective of Kotiswaran. So Dr. Julia O'Connell Davidson is professor of social research at Bristol University. She's currently working on a project, Histories of Enslaved Peoples, Efforts to Move Closer to Freedom in the Atlantic War Can Teach Us About the Pursuit and Practice of Freedom by Marginalized Groups Today. But also as a sociologist, she has a longstanding interest in capitalist employments, relations, and social organizations of work, including sex work. Julia today will actually discuss her reservations about recasting sex work as care work or socially productive labor. Julia, welcome.
See if I can manage.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much to Sharmila and Niina for inviting me to speak. And I'm going to talk about my reservations about reframing sex work as a form of care work or social reproductive labour. And those efforts, I think, connect to a kind of Marxist feminist line of thought that in other respects I'm a great admirer of and find very convincing. But I'm not convinced by the shift to framing sex work through that lens. So I thought I'd use this talk to talk about my reservations, but whether or not they're grounded, I feel that the themes that you're addressing are incredibly rich, and I'm really looking forward to hearing the rest of the papers. And I'm very open to learning that I'm wrong, which wouldn't be the first time. So if you think about why people are talking about sex work in relation to care and socially reproductive labour, I think it's for a very important reason. And that concerns the hugely damaging stigma that attaches to people who sell sexual services. And I think that we can understand that stigma in relation to the dominant conceptual scheme that in liberal societies is used to order and explain social reality. And obviously, as feminists have pointed out, that's a scheme that imagines two different solid domains, the public market sphere and the private domestic sphere. And obviously, work fits into the public market sphere where labour power is exchanged as a commodity and where your obligations to an employer are delimited by contract. And here's the sphere where people are supposed to satisfy their economic and material wants. And then the private domestic sphere, where effortful activities are supposedly undertaken on the basis of ideas about duty or reciprocity or care or affection and so on. And that's the sphere where emotional and sexual wants are in theory supposed to be satisfied. So sex work becomes an anomaly through that lens, and it's a matter out of place, which in Mary Douglas's famous formulation, and so you get all the ideas about pollution and dirt and so on. And you also, as Mary Douglas noted, that cultures find ways of dealing with what they've constructed as anomalous events and or phenomena. And I'm sure everybody here is very familiar with the various but always oppressive and sometimes lethal ways in which social and legal ways that different societies have devised in order to deal with that anomaly of sex work. So, you know, the idea that sex work is a threatening anomaly leads to extremely negative outcomes for those who sell sex, even when it's dressed up as care or victims of trafficking. These are interventions that work to actually control and restrain women. Obviously, there are strands of liberal thought that don't sanction those types of control, but then also they don't really address the stigma, and they definitely don't consider the class, gender, and race inequalities that are connected to sex work. And then, of course, we have another approach that's offered by radical feminists, or perhaps I should say feminists formerly known as radical, that seems to have been rebranded as gender critical feminism now. And that obviously does offer a critique of the liberal binary of public and private. And definitely for radical feminists, sex work is not an anomaly, it's definitely sex, not work. But although that line of thought challenges the conceptual binaries in one respect, it actually holds very tightly onto other of the binaries that are associated with this liberal conceptual scheme, like man, woman, active, passive, subject, object. And through that lens, female sex workers become eternal victims and non-agential subjects. And that also reinforces stigma, and it also can be used to justify violent state interventions into the lives of sex workers. And so that's how you get this kind of seamless slippage of care into control and those strange alliances between radical feminists and morally conservative politicians. So my thinking was, if you're critical of both the radical feminist and moral conservative take on sex work, and you're critical of markets under global racial patriarchal capitalism, then how do you conceptualize sex work? And obviously that's where Marxist feminist conversations about care work and socially reproductive labor come in. So Marxist feminist theorists critiqued the critique of capitalism from orthodox Marxism, which was very much focused on how production is organized in capitalist economies and how class power was reproduced in the capitalist labor process in factories and other public work settings. But as people like Nancy Fraser point out, and many more, this isn't the whole story, because to quote Fraser, the official economy within a capitalist society depends on a background of social relations, practices, institutions that are all constructed as non-economic. Behind the realm of capitalist production lies a realm where the daily and generational reproduction of members of society occurs, without which there would be no workers to sell their labour power to across the market. So they're talking about reproductive labour as a form of labour that capitalist employers and the ownership class more generally that they benefit from, but they don't pay for. So in place of this imagined separation of public and private, these theorists are stressing the complete dependence of capitalist markets on the devalued reproductive labour performed in the home. And that analysis was one that led to the establishment of the Wages for Housework campaign in the 1970s, which Silvia Federici described as a revolutionary strategy to make invisible work more visible and to disrupt the structural reliance of capitalism on unpaid work of mostly women. And then more recently, you've got social reproduction theorists like Niki Bhattacharya, who talks about productive and socially reproductive labour as being temporally and spatially divided. So socially reproductive labour is what comes before and after work, after paid work. And she uses the term to cover everything that's necessary to raise successive generations of workers and to ensure that an individual worker can actually get up in the morning and go back to work. So she uses all of the term life-making activities to cover all of these actions that are undertaken to maintain and make life. So as well as housework, that includes physically giving birth, the labour involved in rearing children, the labour involved in assuring the well-being of the elderly, the disabled, and so on. And thinkers like Fraser and Bhattacharya also include health, publicly provisioned health, education, social care, and so on. Again, devalued and low wage, but absolutely vital to sustaining capitalist economies. And a lot of people have drawn attention to how the COVID pandemic really visibilized capitalism's dependence in a very graphic and tragic way, that dependence on these kinds of essential workers. So analytic concepts need to be precise to be useful. And actually, I'm already getting a bit uncomfortable with how big socially reproductive labour has become as a category. But it's even bigger in some definitions of it. For instance, Barbagallo and Federici wrote that they treat care work as a particular aspect of reproductive work, and they use that to refer to all of these other things I've mentioned: cleaning, shopping, preparing food, and so on. But also emotional support, like listening or consoling, teaching and disciplining children, the labour required to anticipate, prevent or resolve crises, to keep up good relations with kin and neighbours. And to this they add sex work, saying that a key component of care work is sex work, and drawing on Laura Augustin's work to say that it's an activity that reproduces social life in the same way that other bodily services do, often including company, self-esteem boosting conversation, and it's essential to our reproduction as eating food or keeping a healthy environment. But for me, including sex work in this actually highlights some questions about reproductive labour as an analytic concept. So here's my main reservations. That firstly, it's very clear that social reproduction theorists want and need to talk about much more than the effort that's required just to secure the bare minimum necessary to keep a human being alive, because there's a big difference between what must be done just in order to stave off death and what most people do in households and consider to be necessary to making a life. But then once you do that and acknowledge that there's more to it than that, it becomes a question of where do you draw the line? You know, how much labour is necessary to maintain good relations with kin and neighbours, for instance. How many dishes do you need to prepare in order to biologically feed yourself and your family and so on? And if you include activities that aren't strictly necessary to staying alive, then how do you draw a line between the activities that are caring and socially reproductive and the activities that are geared towards leisure or pleasure or the gratification of wants rather than needs, or even between reproductive labour and acts of love and solidarity? Because very often, even if people are undertaking an activity that in theory meets biological needs for, say, food or protection, they're not necessarily only undertaking those activities for that purpose. So, for instance, I loathe and detest shopping for clothes or food, but I believe there are some people who actually view that as a pleasurable leisure activity, and they shop for something more than simply to ensure basic survival. And actually, even thinking about the effort that's expended on looking after children or elderly parents and so on, there's a mix of reasons that people do this. It can be pleasurable and life-affirming, as well as a duty or a responsibility or a chore. And certainly if you think about sex work, then it's not something that's undertaken because it's biologically necessary to keep the customer alive. So it strikes me as kind of reductive and also sociologically and ethnographically wrong to recast all life-making activities that people engage in outside wage work as labour directed towards reproducing a workforce for capital. That might be one result of the effortful activities that people put into sustaining their homes and partners and families, but it's not the only one, and it's certainly not the main objective. And you know, I feel if I had a partner who felt that they were performing care work or reproductive labour by giving me a hug after I came home from that bad day at work, then I would feel it was definitely time to split up. So another problem is that if you extend the concept of caring reproductive labour to everything and anything we do to maintain our own and others' bodies and well-being and sustain social life, then virtually everybody in society is therefore a reproductive or a care worker, because men as well as women act to anticipate, prevent or resolve crises. They're involved in teaching and disciplining children. The wives of male aristocrats and wealthy bankers, as well as the wives of working class men, provide intimacy and emotional support and maintain relationships with kin. Elite women biologically reproduce the next generation of privileged people. So, like, what is the focus of the analysis? Another problem is that the effortful action that people engage in outside paid work to reproduce themselves and their families and kinship networks are also bound up with reproducing culture and social status, because through these activities we don't just reproduce ourselves as workers, but also as men or as women or as trans or as non-binary, as young, middle-aged, old, as people with a particular class or caste or racialized or ethnic identity. And in making efforts to meet the norms and conventions and standards of life for a person of our particular status and identity, we actually also often help to reproduce the inequalities that are baked into any given culture. So I think the film, The Great Indian Kitchen, gives an amazing insight into how the labour that some Indian housewives perform in the kitchen reproduces, albeit reluctantly, a system of patriarchal domination at the same time as meeting the biological needs of their male relatives for food. And likewise, you can think about the global racial, gendered and class relations that are reproduced through the labour of people who service global north package holiday makers. And again, package holiday makers, some of whom are working class, would say that this is something that their holidays were life-making activities. So then a fourth problem, I think, is that life-making activities are not only intimately bound up with the reproduction of social hierarchies and inequalities, but also with markets, and that's increasingly so under the neoliberal regime of capitalism. You've not only got that many health, educational, residential care services are provided by private firms, and so they're sites in which profit is exacted from workers' labour power, and that lots of private households are sites of paid labour, but also that many activities which once took place in households now involve market exchanges. So in the UK and the US, for instance, even when people do still make meals at home, they very often simply assemble things that waged workers have pre-prepared elsewhere. And instead of cleaning and mending shoes and clothes that have become grubby lots of people just replace them. So a lot of labour that once took place in households has been displaced into the realm of the capitalist economy. So, producing value that can be appropriated profit. And the workers who today are in workplace settings, chopping vegetables or washing and packaging salad or making cheap clothes to replace torn items, they do receive wages, but securing wages for this housework has not actually proved very revolutionary. Care and a multitude of other life-making activities are both a site of capitalist exploitation and a site of consumption today, which is all about reproducing the society that we live in. And I think that it follows that economy and society and productive and reproductive spheres are enmeshed with each other. Yes, it's still in the way that 1970s Marxist feminists identified. Yes, still that the capitalist economy relies on unwaged invisible labour, but they're also entangled in many other senses. And so that the market is increasingly essential to reproduction. And actually, even if you think about the essential workers that we were encouraged to clap for on Thursday nights during lockdown, many of them were doing things, yes, say the delivery drivers, they were delivering food and medicine that people needed, but they were also delivering many other luxury items. So actually, apparently, a recent consumer survey found that people in Britain had spent more than £57.6 billion on treats during the pandemic, and those were delivered to their homes by delivery workers. So then that takes me to the question of, does it actually matter whether sex work is care work or not? Because if you think about the blurriness of all those binaries, then I think you have to see that actually lots of workers are straddling both spheres, and that means that many workers can take a certain amount of pride in their work and truthfully tell themselves that it's got a certain social value. Like even a checkout operator at Sainsbury's can feel good about chatting to a lonely shopper, or about supplying food that's necessary to somebody's life. But the thing is that there's a limit, because they're at work, they're not doing what they're doing in order to care. So if a checkout operator has a customer who comes with a shopping trolley full of Red Bull and Mars bars, and they think, oh, it's probably not in their best interest to really go and consume all of this, it's not that the checkout operator can challenge that and say, look, don't do that, have these healthy bananas instead. Yet actual care, as Joan Tronto has argued, isn't just about acquiescing to people's whims and fancies and giving them what they say they want. It's also often about saying no. And I think there's a more complicated relationship between care and control than just a simple opposition. And that's one reason why the marketization of medicine is so troubling. And if you think about Michael Jackson's doctor who was earning $150,000 a month and supplying Michael Jackson with exactly what he wanted in terms of painkillers and other drugs. But I don't think that can be described as care. So if I think about that and then move to sex work, I think obviously we have to recognize that sex work is incredibly diverse, and I absolutely don't dispute the fact that some sex workers may sometimes feel good about providing emotional and psychic solace to people who are disabled and lonely, for instance. And I know that some sex workers develop, genuinely affectionate relationships with their regular clients, for example. And yes, obviously, because it's a form of personal service work, it requires emotional as well as physical labour, and part of that is to provide a semblance of caring. But sex workers aren't paid to decipher what's truly in the best interest of their client. They're paid to provide the service that the client says they want. So, you know, it's, at base, it's a market exchange. It's not a charitable endeavour. And that makes me also think, but, you know, so what? Why should sex workers be care workers? Because very few people in capitalist societies have the opportunity, the luxury of devoting their entire working life to actually caring for others. You know, in fact, as David Prabha pointed out, a significant proportion of jobs of the working population are bullshit jobs. They're pointless workers as flunkies or box tickers or taskmasters. And I would add to that, they're also pointless productive work producing bullshit consumer goods that, you know, are not only meaningless, but, you know, actively environmentally destructive. And also focusing on this question about the intrinsic value, social value of particular forms of work, I think obscures other connections that exist between work and care. In particular, the fact that caring responsibilities often play a large part in leading people to choose a particular form of work or to remain in it, even when it's a bullshit job. I'm increasingly demoralized, even disgusted by the way that universities have been turned into corporations that are run increasingly on neoliberal lines and making it impossible to fulfill what I would believe truly is my duty of care to students and others. But I haven't quit or retired, and that's because the bottom line is I need to pay my mortgage and keep myself and my daughter in the lifestyle to which we are accustomed. And I think that lots of other people, including many sex workers, choose their earning strategy as the best or only way of providing for themselves and their dependents. And thinking about that bottom line, the fact that people are choosing livelihood opportunities, I think takes us back to focusing on the state more, because we shouldn't forget that liberal theory actually posits a double divide, public-private divide. It's not just that liberal theory says that the private domestic life is separate from the public realm, but also that it says that public political life is separate from the market. So the state, the law, civil society, which is the realm where people are constituted as persons, is imagined as being separate from economic life, the market world. But in reality, actually, economic and political life, or market and state, are mutually imbricated just as much as productive and reproductive life are mutually implicated. And the state is massively implicated, not only in the construction of markets, but also in the construction of what counts as home life and the organization of biological and social reproduction and the extent to which they're marketized. So key features of the neoliberal economic reforms that have taken place worldwide since the 1970s are A, the privatization and marketization of socially reproductive activities that were once non-economic, provided by state or unpaid household members, and B, the stripping away of the types and degree of social protection that states offer in the form of welfare, pensions, housing, education, health, and so on, all of which are protection against the market. So because of the lack of protections against the market, more and more people are forced to take on waged work in worse conditions or on worse terms, or to supplement it with a variety of market exchanges, just in order to be able to survive and to be able to engage in these life-making activities or to engage in social reproduction. And then the question of who states include and exclude from social protection has a massive impact on who agrees to enter into what kinds of market exchange and why. You know, again, if you think back to the pandemic, I don't know back or it was ongoing, but anyway, think of the pandemic, the people there were who were low paid, often racialized as black or brown, and above all, people whose immigration status gave them no recourse to public funds, and who were therefore excluded from the packages that the government gave to other workers to protect them from that bleak choice between, do I eat or do I put my life on the line and go out and contract a potentially fatal disease? And around much of the world, in many countries, even the basic food baskets or furlough packages that were provided to, say, self-employed or informal workers during the pandemic excluded sex workers who weren't eligible for those kinds of protections and therefore had to continue to work. So just to conclude, I guess I feel there's a risk that if you argue that sex workers should be respected because they undertake socially valuable, caring labour, that you risk creating new hierarchies and fresh divisions. You make some workers seem as though they're you know, more deserving than others or more respectable than others. So it strikes me that rather than trying to destigmatize sex work by repositioning it as caring work or socially reproductive labour, that perhaps we should try to achieve the same end, but by de-exceptionalizing sex work and acknowledging these sort of similarities, acknowledging the fact that virtually all work and employment under neoliberal capitalism actually requires us to prostitute ourselves in one way or another. It's not exceptional. And also to emphasize that everybody, whether university lecturer or heart surgeon or delivery driver or sex worker, is entitled to rights and protection as workers on the basis that they are workers, not that they're doing something that's of immense social value. And that we all deserve rights and respect, not because of the contribution that we make to society. There's not everybody's in a position to make a contribution to society, but you know, on the basis that we're all human beings. And I suppose my feeling is, and this is where I go back to agreeing with Marxist feminist visions of the future, is that, you know, this is a way to make visible the massive gap between how we currently work and consume and care under capitalism, and how we could all work and consume and care in a world that was organized according to different political principles and economic imperatives. You know, how it would be different if we were laboring and trying to sustain ourselves and care for others in a borderless world, for instance, or in a world in which whiteness and maleness and heterosexuality had been eviscerated of privilege, in a world where labor and nature and money were decommodified, and there was a human and sustainable global economy, which was one where productive activity was shared amongst those able to undertake it and organized to satisfy the needs of all.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hoping that this will open it up for great discussion later. Our next speaker is Dr. Prabha. She is a professor of law and social justice at King's College. Her main areas of research include criminal law, transnational criminal law, sociology of law, post-colonial theory, and feminist legal theory. She has authored Dangerous Sex, which I guess you know, its subtitle, which is Invisible Labor, Sex Work and Law in India. And she is also the editor of Sex Work, which is a volume like she edited. So as part of a collaborative project with Janet Haley, Rachel Ribosh, and Hila Shamir on governance feminism, she also co-authored a book which we also are familiar with, Governance Feminism. And and she's currently managing a research project on the laws of action. Prabha plans to assess the vocabulary of care in relation to sex work through a reading of the 2020 Care Manifesto, and argue for a focus on social reproduction instead, and conclude with how the Indian sex workers movement is arguing both for sex work to be recognized as a form of reproductive labor and for sex workers' rights to social reproduction. Welcome.
Go back. And then slides. There we go. And then from the beginning. Got it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this very kind invitation. And it's a tough act to follow. Julia is a tough act to follow, but I'll try. Thanks for the invitation to rethink care in the context of sex work and obviously the post-pandemic moment. Can I sit down? Is quite a unique one for thinking about care again. So in my talk today, I want to query what this renewed interest in care means for sex work. And I want to start by critically assessing a recent text on a feminist care agenda, namely the 2020 Care Manifesto, which was produced by the Care Collective, comprising of 5 academic activists, Lynn Segal, Joe Littler, Jamie Hakim, Catherine Rottenberg, and Andreas Chatzidakis. So based on this, and this is just an example, it happens to be a handy example through which to understand, the care agenda, but you could pick up any other text essentially that looks at care, and there's a very diverse set of scholars working in the area of care, and feminist economists working on care talk about care very differently than potentially what the Care Manifesto focuses on. So based on this, I suggest that using and retaining a focus on social reproduction instead is analytically and politically more productive for the sex workers movement. And then I look specifically at the Indian sex workers movement. And as Simanti has already mentioned, the movement has long advocated for a recognition of sex work as a form of reproductive labor. But the pandemic has offered us a political opportunity to go beyond, to creatively assert sex workers' rights to social reproduction. So I want to examine judicial lawmaking as a site through which to reflect on the interrelated nature of these claims and what is necessary then in order to realize sex workers' right to social reproduction. If I have the time, I'll probably try and briefly respond to some of the very provocative questions and really important questions that Julia has raised in relation to social reproduction theory. And it would be great to actually have an engagement on some of those really crucial points of critique. So I want to start with the Care Manifesto, which defines, it's a little orange book. It has 6 chapters. It talks about various aspects of care. And here we have a definition of care to the extent that it's ever possible, where they talk about hands-on care, the kind of care that happens within the family, the kind of care that workers carry out in care homes and hospitals and teachers do in schools, and the everyday services provided by essential workers. But the Care Collective also talks about care in a more capacious sense. Care as a social capacity, an activity involving the nurturing of all that is necessary for the welfare and flourishing of life. And so, here, rather than restrict themselves to the provision of care within the household, the authors use the lens of care to envision restructuring of the community, of the state, and of the market. And this shifts the focus away from care merely being a feminist issue, where care is thought of as being predominantly performed by women, to recognizing that care is performed by various actors in society, including men. So it does not presume that women are somehow superior moral actors who are in a better position to intuitively perform care work. Similarly, the debate around care is not shoehorned into liberal feminist agendas, where we are persuaded to look at care work as a problem, right? It's a problem of unpaid domestic and care work is seen as an obstacle to greater participation in economic work and paid work. Instead, the manifesto underlines the importance of unpaid work to our well-being as human beings and as a community, and then goes on to talk about how we should distribute its joys and burdens across society. So this rather expansive definition of care, and I completely agree with Julia in her critique of where does one draw the boundaries around care. But let's just play out what their arguments are. And this leads to two key arguments of the manifesto. The first is its diagnosis of the lack of care that proliferates social life. And the second focuses on its vision of a world society which is based on universal care, where care is at the very center of life. So the foundational diagnosis of carelessness, as they call it, is the fact that neoliberalism has neither an affective practice of nor a vocabulary for care, and that it is uncaring by design. And then in the following chapters, they talk about how current structures of kinship, the state and the market prioritize profit making to the detriment of people making. And I use this phrase from the Feminism for 99%, which authored by Nancy Fraser, Titi Bhattacharya, and one more author. So as a solution, what the authors of the Care Collective, they tell us that the programmatic elements of the Care Manifesto envisions a model of universal care, whereby we should encompass more promiscuous models of kinship, reclaim forms of genuinely collective and communal life, adopt alternatives to capitalist markets, and resist the marketization of care and care infrastructures, and then restore and radically deepen our welfare states, and so on and so forth. And needless to say, in some ways, it's very hard to actually disagree with much of this. Just as, whatever the problems with care theory or social reproduction theory, I think we are all in general agreement about, the current state of affairs. And the question is really, how do we use this in the kind of research and activism that we do? But what I want to ask here is whether, what do we gain and what do we lose by this kind of framing of care? And I believe that actually social reproduction theory offers a better vocabulary for understanding sex work for the following reasons, and why focusing on care can be problematic. And this is simply looking at the Care Manifesto in particular. So, for example, care has a way, the terminology of care has a way of flattening what care involves. At the same time, the terminology of care seems to do a lot of work, which is not always illuminating, right? So it has a very strong interpersonal quality. Individuals have this burden of affect when you talk about care talk, and it feels like it's a character trait. So either you're caring or you're careless. And this, unfortunately, in the Care Manifesto seeps into, their description of various institutions, which is a bit befuddling. How do you think of institutions as a whole as being caring or uncaring? And this is what the Care Manifesto talks about the state being uncaring, the market being uncaring, and being careless. And the flip side, the question is really, can we ever think of a caring state or of a caring market? The second issue with the vocabulary of care is that it presupposes a certain community. So, you essentially need a community of care. And here they talk about how the care is our individual and common ability to provide the political, social, material, and emotional conditions that allow the vast majority of people and living creatures on the planet to thrive. So clearly, it's not as though the authors of the manifesto are not aware of how the care agenda can be appropriated by conservative communitarian forces, which are exclusionary. But I think when it comes to sex work, exclusion is the norm. So, for sex workers, whatever you look at, whether it's kinship relations, the state, the market, or the community, they're both on their own and collectively, not just uncaring, they're fundamentally violent, right? They're violent by default. So there is a problem here. The third problem is that so in its, the authors of the Care Manifesto talk about, hands-on care versus care with a capital C. So there is a point in the book where they talk about how care can generate very ambivalent feelings. And I think they literally talk about, clearing excreta, that's the kind of work that care work often might involve. And they talk about how this generates ambivalent feelings, but that these feelings can be somehow addressed with resources and time. So, it seems to be that, they want to address ambivalence with, if you just paid care workers more, or if you, respected their time more, that in fact, you can somehow address ambivalence. But actually, we know that many abject forms of care, like sex work, surrogacy, or stripping, are unlikely to become less stigmatized, even if well-resourced or better paid. If anything, they're already actually better paid. If you look at the wages that a woman with similar skills and education pursuing other jobs may actually secure. So there's a way in which the lens of care flattens out the differences between various forms of reproductive labor, and for which the author's equally blunt suggestion that resources and time would somehow ameliorate the ambivalences do not actually ring true at all. I think the other problem with care talk happens to be also that it fails to address, certainly in the book, why the most abject forms of labor are performed by certain groups of people, right, who are marked by their gender, class, caste, or racial status. And it's not just the affective aspect of care that generates ambivalences, and the inequalities embedded in the organization of such care are equally critical. So defetishizing care actually comes at the expense of forefronting concerns of inequality as a central concern for feminism. Similarly, the authors claim that the pathologization and undervaluation of care is due to its association with feminine performers, but there's no talk of how we can actually dislodge some of these entrenched stereotypes. So I think while an expansive understanding of care has its benefits, I think in zooming out too much, from who actually performs the care, there's a risk of not being able to account for mal-distributed patterns of care along especially the lines of gender. And I think the final thing that I find problematic about the Care Manifesto is its overstatement of the role of neoliberal capital. So the Care Manifesto lays the blame for rampant carelessness at the feet of neoliberal capital. And it talks about, the book acknowledges that there are other market formations that you might encounter, like they talk about the agora or petty traders and so on, but also insists that neoliberal capitalism has a colonizing market rationality that is dominant. Hence, market-driven lack of care is said to afflict every level of society. And I think here, actually, there is a tendency to overstate the role of neoliberal capital. It also causes conceptual confusion because actually they talk about how it is neoliberal capitalist care that remains detached, both casual and indifferent with disastrous consequences. But the question is then whether care is bad because it is delivered in a neoliberal capitalist setting, or and whether a carer is detached, casual and indifferent. If that is in fact the case, is that even care? So there are some problems here. And further, I think looking at it from the perspective of many global South countries, but even the global South and the global North, we cannot simply assume these linear narratives about neoliberal capitalism. So, for example, if we think of sex work in India, for instance, there are specific labor relations that continue to still draw on agrarian traditions in the way that money is distributed within sex work. If you look at red light areas in major cities that emerged during colonial rule, you still find them, they still exist. And so we find an interrupted logic of capital, where the narrative of, say, gentrification is very uneven, and we need better conceptual schema to actually understand very varied outcomes that you might see in other contexts. So, for example, here I like to draw on the work of anthropologist Maura Finkelstein, who talks about, for example, mill workers in Bombay who are confronted with the rapid gentrification of their neighborhoods, where this is the heart of Bombay. And she talks about how they live in what she calls lively ruination, where there is a collision of alternative times, those of industrialism and post-industrialism. And she actually talks about how not being able to appreciate these alternative times means that it results in the non-recognition of these quote unquote others of capital. So I think we have to be really careful about where we, how we talk about neoliberalism. And I think even within the manifesto, this narrative actually breaks down. Because if in fact neoliberal capital corrodes our ability to care, then how is it that the authors themselves are able to point to so many instances of caring behavior? And there's a very long list in the book, actually. So there's a sort of paradox here, because an expansive understanding of care means that we all care more than conventional definitions of care would actually capture. So in fact, it may turn out that we all care more than we could ever imagine, right? So we care for our neighbors, our co-workers, our extended family, our children's school communities, our cultural associations, hobby communities. We can actually name it. We are all already promiscuous carers. So the final part of the manifesto is that it is a manifesto, so we can't really hold it to being a blueprint of any sort. But very interestingly, there is and this goes back to its anchoring in a communitarian sense of care. There's actually in all the chapters in the manifesto, there's no chapter on civil society, right? That very important aspect of transnational life today that actually mediates between communities, the state, and transnational organizations, which really drive so many of our policy choices. So this is something which is missing in the manifesto. And problematically, for somebody who works in the area of governance feminism, it's interesting that there's no account of how very radical ideas actually become quite depoliticized very quickly. And so we need to have a better accounting for these kind of domestic and transnational civil society groups, which we've tried to show through our work on governance feminism. And I think sex workers are no stranger to this, the effects of very highly organized and coordinated actions of abolitionists and anti-trafficking organizations, who since the late 1990s have really managed to expand the carceral legal framework around trafficking and the international humanitarian aid conflict. So any form of sex work activism needs to have a very strong understanding of these transnational formations. And for this, the care paradigm doesn't actually help us very much. So now I want to make a shift to social reproduction. And certainly I think social reproduction theory doesn't come from this does not presume a communitarian consensus that a care paradigm requires. And you don't necessarily find the hierarchy of care, which the care paradigm requires. And the ambivalences of hands-on care is not really. It doesn't pretend to address it through through allocations of time and money and so on. So here I want to talk very briefly about the kind of definition of social reproduction that I use. In a sense that it reinforces what Julia has already mentioned. You can find that this definition, which I draw on Shirindra and Carolyn Hoskins' definition, relates to the reproduction of communal life, but it's largely anchored around the labor which is performed within the household. And so reproductive labor, which is performed outside the household, receives little attention. But of course, since the 70s, the vocabulary of reproductive labor has really expanded quite considerably. And in various sectors of work, you find, the use of reproductive labor to make visible what has otherwise simply been and continues to be characterized purely as violence, whether it's sex work, whether it's dancing, whether it's surrogacy, whether it's egg donation, and so on. And we find that movements of workers, and I think this is where it's very important, social reproduction theory is also something that has been used by social movements to articulate their own understanding of work as a form of reproductive labor, often drawn from materialist feminist thinking. And I think over time, these binaries that Julia rightly pointed to which have prevented the recognition of reproductive labor within Marxist and materialist feminist thinking, have been deconstructed. So the divides between production, reproduction, the economy, the social, the market, the household, public, private, what is wage, what is unwage. So there's a very extensive body of work on social reproduction that, really, I think very productively, challenges these divides. And of course, there's a very extensive body of literature on global care chains and the international dimension of it, which is really quite critical. We also find within social reproduction theory, there's been a sort of Foucauldian turn where feminists are equally interested in the cultural work that is required to shape the subjectivities of reproductive laborers and their subjects under conditions of neoliberalism. And these scholars pay attention to the interaction between non-humans and processes of social reproduction. Studies of social reproduction in their work also covers a range of institutional settings, not only the home, but the predictable institutions like childcare centers, nursing homes, but also dance halls, camps, orphanages, churches, and so on. So there's a very extensive literature here on social reproduction. And they focus not only capitalist economies, but also on diverse economies, including non-capitalist economies and para-capitalist economies. And studies of social reproduction also look at the role of men increasingly, not just the role of women. So in a certain sense, as Cindy Katz has noted, social reproduction is everywhere and nowhere. And we find, theorists of social reproduction also lament the fact that we have such a wide variety of definitions today and applications of social reproduction theory, with slippages, overlaps, and analytical messiness. So I think Julia has already illustrated quite clearly some of these problems. And we find that also the possibilities for political action have actually expanded within social reproduction theory. So, broader political struggles for housing, food security, universal basic income, these are all reimagined by feminists as being fundamentally about social reproduction today. So in a certain sense, we find that there are these parallel careers of the concept of care and social reproduction, and they actually track some pretty familiar, they parallel each other quite interestingly, and they have very similar explanations for the crisis in social reproduction or the carelessness that the Care Manifesto talks about, and then often come to the alternative, which is a robust feminist, queer, anti-racist, and eco-socialist perspective. So actually, I won't go into too much detail on why I find social reproduction theory more powerful, but I think it helps us. It's an analytical perspective through which to map labor relations. What are the factors that shape labor relations? It gives us a handle through which to understand the political economy of work. It helps us account for institutional arrangements that reproduce inequalities and how to make claims in the state for both recognition and redistribution, and then to practically realize some of those political goals. So maybe here might be a point where I'll speak very briefly about some of the questions that Julia raised. So I don't see social reproduction as simply saying that it is restricted to what the bare minimum is, and therefore the question of what happens when there's a surplus, when you're talking about consumption or leisure and so on. So I think in fact, and this is not very clear in the mainstream of social reproduction theory, but there are scholars like Shamita Sen, for example, who talks about there needing to be different theories of social reproduction. So she talks about her work with domestic workers in Calcutta, and she actually talks about how the arrangements that we have, the way we think about social reproduction theory in terms of the role of the family, the state, the market, and so on, looks very different when you look at domestic workers who commute into Calcutta to perform work. So the way they understand marriage, the way they understand family, and what it allows them and doesn't allow them, looks very different from a more elitist perspective on social reproduction theory. So I think there is room here for different theories of social reproduction. I think then one of the other questions which Julia asked about, which is measurement, how do you, and this is a very important question around redistribution. And I think this is something that many disciplines have thought about. Certainly feminist economists have done a lot of work on measurement. And it's quite fascinating to see how in different disciplines people approach this issue of unpaid work and how to measure it quite differently. So feminist economists have their own repertoire of, how exactly do you measure unpaid work, and have methodologically come up with things like time use surveys and very different kinds of time use surveys, different methodologies to actually measure, unpaid work. Similarly, I can certainly report from the discipline of law how there are different ways of measuring unpaid work. So some of the work that I've done on, how, wives who have died in motor vehicles accidents, when they've died, their dependents have come before courts and said, well, we need compensation for the work that these women were doing within the home. And courts have to, unlike other fields, courts have to arrive at decisions, right? So you find a very broad range of methods that courts use to value the unpaid work of women. Sometimes it's the opportunity cost. What would the woman have earned? Has she gone out and worked? Sometimes it's replacement cost. What would it take if you hired, passed it out to the market to, perform the same kind of unpaid work? Some of them look at minimum wage tables. So I just want to say that it's a very live, and there are many different methods, and each method has pros and cons. And so you need to have a vocabulary not only of recognition of unpaid work, but of redistribution. And I think here is the fantasy, the feminist fantasy that, we can represent, women's interests is just that. It's a fantasy, because actually every time you change a rule to produce benefits for a certain group of women, actually it has adverse consequences for another group of women. So I think this is sadly, the problem is that in making the case for recognition, the real issues around redistribution are quite hard to address. But I think this is very important to put back on the agenda. And I also want to say that the question of care and social reproduction, as this relates to the work that I'm doing now, is to really look at different forms of reproductive labor to understand them on a sectoral basis. And I think the logics that drive sex work are quite different from the way, how these forms of work, even as reproductive labor, are discussed by workers as well as people working on them, are quite different. So I'm looking at sex work, dancing, surrogacy, paid domestic work, and unpaid domestic work. So you can map on this spectrum from marriage to the market, quite different logics, quite different legal treatments of these various forms of social reproduction. So I think that's again a vocabulary that we need to explore. And finally, on the question of neoliberalism, where we are talking about, I think Julia made a very crucial observation around how the state and the market are crucially, shaping each other. But I think the point at which I would say disagreement, but I think again this is depends largely upon the context. So certainly in the Indian context, it's a very perplexing development. But just as neoliberalism took shape in the 1990s, we find also the passage of a Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which no one would make sense of if you thought that structural adjustment policies that shape, change the very way the economy works in India. You'd be very hard pressed to explain this somewhat socialist piece of legislation that brings back on the state the responsibility to employ people who don't have jobs. It's a demand-driven law. So I think it's very hard to understand the relationships between state and market, and I think we just have to think about how it plays out in different parts of the world. Now I just want to, am I open? Okay. So I just come to this question now also. So like I said earlier, my own interest in social reproduction theory actually came from the Varmahila Samanvaya Committee, who Simanti has worked very closely with as well, who used actually the very same Marxist materialist feminist theorizing that excluded sex work as a form of labor to re-theorize it. So I think it is possible to be a materialist feminist and a sex worker advocate. And again, I won't go into this in too much detail, but you find over time, the Indian sex workers movement making claims for recognition of, sex work as a form of labor, but also, trying to think about labor in quite creative ways. And I think here, so here I'll actually skip a little bit and talk about how, so I think they've kind of gone to, but anyway, it's too tempting to miss. Anyway, I'll just say a little bit about how, so the focus on redistribution was very central to the Indian sex workers movement, has always been. But in the past 20 years, I think we have all been quite distracted by the anti-trafficking interventions, which has really undermined this kind of redistributive work. So I just want to say elsewhere, I've talked about how anti-trafficking discourse and the terms that it has set up for us in terms of choice and coercion has had a cost. And the cost is precisely to think about a theory of exploitation, to rethink regulation, to think about the conflicting interests of sex workers themselves vis-a-vis each other. Similarly, I think efforts at redistribution is undermined when we focus on the legal treatment of sex work. So there is too much focus on criminalize or decriminalize. And here actually, the abolitionists think use the power of the criminal law to eliminate exploitation in sex work and sex work altogether. Whereas sex work advocates think if you decriminalize, immediately sex workers will actually be empowered, and both of them are quite flawed. So I think for a truly transformative form of redistribution, we need to go beyond presenting sex work as a form of social reproduction to addressing sex workers' rights to social reproduction. And I think both of these claims are very closely interconnected, and they're presented as such to the state. So in fact, if you think of Partha Chatterjee's idea of political society, where he talks of how population groups are not able to make claims on the state because they're not proper citizens, they often appeal to the state for welfare benefits, right? It's the realm of welfare in which some of these political struggles actually manifest. So the DMSC, for example, doesn't ask for the repeal of the local anti-sex work law. They've always asked for all kinds of welfare benefits. And the state is also amenable to giving this rather than decriminalize or offer legalization. They'd rather give sex workers benefits as disadvantaged groups of society. So I just want to come to the most recent thing that's preoccupying a lot of us working on sex work in India today, which is a judicial mediation of both these claims. So one of the cases, so I just want to say the judicial realm has been a very productive site for both the abolitionists as well as the sex workers movement in India. And it's the abolitionists who managed to push the state into drafting a very draconian trafficking bill. But at the same time, we had this case in 2010 where it was actually a criminal law case around the murder of a sex worker, which the Supreme Court viewed as a public interest litigation. And the case has been going on since 2010. They constituted a panel to advise the court on rehabilitation of sex workers. And this is known as the Karmaskar case. So very interestingly, sex workers groups like DMSC, which were on the panel, very skillfully reoriented this discourse around coerced institutionalized rehabilitation towards one that looked at voluntary rehabilitation, but also dignity for sex workers who wanted to continue doing sex work. The case hasn't actually found resolution, but what happened during the pandemic was that the panel gave a report in 2016, which was a very ambitious report. It's a wonderful read. But in September 2020, the lawyers for the DMSC, which is the Lawyers Collective, activated one of the recommendations of the panel, which is that sex workers should be issued ration cards. And, so of course, this is like an English thing. We use this idea of ration cards to ensure access to the public food distribution system. Now, the Indian anti-sex work law clearly, punishes various aspects of sex work, which means sex workers cannot show proof of residence, which means they can't access ration cards, and they can't access a whole set of documents issued by the government. So in this case, the court said, well, this is unacceptable. So they passed a series of orders between Feb 2020 to date, where they recognize the state's duty to provide for the social reproduction of all citizens. So here they talk about how the basic needs of a human being are food, clothing, and shelter. So they say sex workers have actually suffered a lot during the pandemic, and the court issued directions to distribute dry rations to sex workers without insisting on proof of identity. And also alongside that, made sure that all the bureaucratic hurdles which had presented themselves in terms of sex workers not being able to access other identity documents would be basically eliminated through action of the courts. So they said ration cards, voter IDs, and biometric cards, all of this has to be issued without proof of residence. They talked about how the police should not be involved in distributing food. The names of sex workers should be kept confidential. They should be given these cards irrespective of their gender, and actively involved community-based organizations routinely to actually not just go to state organizations, but community-based organizations. So most recently, last week, they went back to the panel's report and issued a path-breaking order to say, well, the government can deter. So the panel recommended decriminalization of sex work, and the government has been dithering on this for a very long time. And the Supreme Court essentially drew a line under this and said, this legal vacuum that has been set up because the government is not making a decision cannot continue anymore. Instead, what we will now do is fill up this legal vacuum. And the court essentially said, notwithstanding the profession, every individual in this country has a right to dignified life under Article 21. So the police, everyone who implements the anti-sex work law, has to make sure that they comply with Article 21, which is the right to life under the Constitution. So actually, I want to share some also, they stopped short of decriminalization, but actually there were lots of slides, lots of orders that the court passed. And I just want to share it because it's rare for a court in any country to use the term sex work and sex workers. And the court was under a lot of pressure to use other terms, but they actually did all of this. And I think they give directions against violence against sex workers. They talk about how there should be no more detention of sex workers in institutionalized homes, and they should be reviewed immediately so that they're released. There is zero tolerance for police abuse, that the court talks about. And importantly, also says that, whatever measures sex workers use for their health and safety cannot be used as incriminating evidence against them. And it gives directions to the media so that they don't show up with their cameras, reveal faces of sex workers during raids. And then talks about sex workers' access to justice. So really to make this meaningful, make rights meaningful, to have workshops and to actually, ensure access to justice. And then importantly, it says at the end that, we have to talk about the right to live with human dignity and make sure that sex workers have the bare minimum. And here, the quote very interestingly uses the very same public health infrastructure, which has been one impetus for sex workers' mobilization in India. Here, the quote, ensures that the public health infrastructure is not just focusing on its narrow health concerns, but actually talks about, the rights of sex workers. And, it does some very innovative things in the order here. To make sure that government agencies fully comply with its orders to issue ID cards to sex workers. So the Supreme Court here looks to the Constitution as the normative foundation based on which sex workers can assert their right to social reproduction. So I think I'll just stop there, and that's it. Thank you.
Prabha, thank you. Illuminating as always. So I'll be next invite collective questions and
So hi everybody, my name is Charlotte and this is my colleague Niki, and we're from the English Collective for Prostitutes. So the ECP was founded in 1975 and we actually came out of the Wages for Housework campaign, which did not end in the 70s as a lot of people think it did. It's still alive and kicking, and we are based at the Crossroads Women's Centre in Kentish Town, where the Wages for Housework campaign is still based till today. So we are a network of sex workers and supporters at the grassroots, campaigning for the decriminalization of sex work and resources such that women can leave sex work if and when we want to. And we are also an international campaign. So we have sister organizations both in the US, the US Prostitutes Collective, as well as in Thailand, an organization called Empower. So we saw that the Symposium actually seeks to reposition sexual labor in the context of care work and social reproduction more broadly. And we assume that this is based on the idea that sex work reproduces social life in the same way that other bodily services do, often including company, self-esteem, music, conversation, and as essential to our reproduction as eating food, etc. And so our first response to this is that we are quite hostile to that view, and that if every type of work that involves human interactions becomes labeled as care work, it will really water down the meaning of care work, the relationships of caring, and paper over the work of mothers and unwaged carers yet again. And the connection between sex work and care work that women in our collective speak about is that sex work is the work we do that allows us to do the caring work for the people that we love. And we are still fighting to establish that most sex workers are mums, and that the money we earn from sex work means a full grocery basket for the week. It means a heated home. It means holidays for ourselves and our children. And it means not having to face the degradation of poverty and not being able to afford the things that other people don't have to think twice about. Not always having to worry about the money in the back of your mind, and how does it amplify when you have people that depend on you and that you have people to take care of. And this is a very obvious way to us that sex work and care work intersect. So as the woman in our network says, most of the other women that I meet on the street are there for very similar reasons, purely to keep their families together, their children out of care. And it gives them a little bit of control about when to have the heating on or not, instead of having to stay in bed with the covers on to stay warm. They go out for an hour and can pay a bill. This is not dishonest work, it is hard work. It is the only job that I have the time to do to fit in with my home life without neglecting my daughter. So many institutions frame sex work as uncaring and neglectful, and on top of that, in a very moralistic way, that sex workers have loose morals, and it's more focused on money and men's needs rather than the needs of our kids, and that sex workers attract disease and violence, and that is why the social services threaten to take away our kids. That these have no qualms rating us over and over again, even though we're just trying to make a living for ourselves and our families, and why sex workers are punished as if we are doing some sort of social ill. And the police raid us because they want to be in charge, and it's really part of a system that doesn't want women to have money. And this is an economic policy that keeps women poor and dependent, and gives us less power to refuse the poorly paid and exploitative jobs and their unreasonable demands, including sexual demands. And we, by no extent, glamorize prostitution. And so Liz, our sister from Empower in Thailand, says, sex work is not a choice, it's a decision. Often the best choice out of a set of not very good choices. And it is dangerous only because it's criminalized and sex workers have no access to justice. So we are campaigning for decriminalization, for safety, for rights and economic alternatives to sex work so that nobody's pushed into sex work or trapped there by poverty. And we know that we won't win decriminalization in a vacuum, and that's the only way to win is to build a movement that will transform society, transform the relations between us and ourselves in the process. So the question for us is always, is a certain theory useful to us in building the movement? And saying that sex work is useful to building a movement for change, because it establishes that we do sex work to earn a living, not because we are degenerate, and that it is a base from which we can demand labor rights, and that it makes the connection between sex workers and other workers, and therefore it's a base for which we can demand support from other workers and from unions, which have more social power than we do. And so what would be the implications of saying that sex work is care work is that it will really also stir hostility from other women, for example, carers like midwives, who don't want to be associated with sex work in that way and who have a right not to be. And therefore, this can be seen as a divisive tactic rather than a tactic that brings us together politically. And some women may describe their sex work as care work, and they have a right to do so. And there's always the pressure on us to appear respectable and to make the case that sex work is socially useful work, but that's an individual decision rather than a political strategy. So in 2019, we actually published research called What's a Nice Girl Like You Doing in a Job Like This? Our own grassroots research to exactly draw out the connection between sex work and other jobs traditionally done by women. So we interviewed nurses, teachers, cleaners, and bar staff, and we found that low pay and exploitative working conditions are common across the board, and that migrant women and women of color get lowest wages and are generally in the most precarious types of work. And we did this to help dismantle the myth that sex work is uniquely exploitative, and that this is the charge that is used against us to oppose our demand for decriminalization a lot of times. So the view that sex work is uniquely exploitative and even that prostitution is violence is still being put forward by women who call themselves feminists. And this is insulting to us as it implies that we don't know the difference between sex that we consent to and rape. And it characterizes sex work as a need of saving rather than work as a need of rights. And it's used to justify calls for criminalization in the form of the criminalization of clients, also known as the Nordic model. And this is despite evidence that shows that criminalization undermines safety, prevents women reporting violence, and it will be devastating to sex workers. And we are forced to focus on defeating these constant threats of the Nordic model and the threats of legislation to criminalize clients. So researchers also crucially found that mothers were discriminated and disadvantaged in the job market with low wages and little consideration of their caring responsibilities in shifts, flexibility, and hours. And this combined with another revelatory finding that sex workers earn more per hour than many other women workers. And this included professional women like midwives and teachers. This has really shown that sex work had more flexibility and showed that, shone a light on why a lot of sex workers are mums. And it also uncovered how much sex work other women workers do. So as Selma James, the founder for the Wages for Housework campaign, said at our Nice Girl research launch, when you're a waitress, there's nothing like service with a smile. Women use our sex because we are the lesser sex and we bargain with it when necessary. So our focus is on building the movement for change. And as I said before, we are based at the Crossroads Women's Centre in Kentish Town in London with 15 other women's organizations. So these includes organizations like Women Against Rape, Women of Color in the Global Women's Strike, Invisible, which is an organization for women with visible and invisible disabilities. And with them and others, we are part of movements against poverty, against sexism and racism, against police abuse, and for immigration rights, for rights for LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, and for resources such as an increase in benefits for housing and better wages. And we are also part of a campaign for the care income, which is international. The petition is on our website, and we are also actually doing a survey which asks a very fundamental question: what do mothers and carers want? And this is available on the Global Women's Strike website as well. So we really think that caring is the job that isn't like any other job. It is a relationship, and it's about putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, paying attention to their needs. And this is, as Selma James says in her new book, Our Time Is Now, Sex, Race, and Class, and Caring for People and Planet. So as I have hinted to before, the ECP started as an autonomous organization of sex workers in the Wages for Housework campaign, now called the Global Women's Strike. And part of that working class tradition is demanding more money and less work. Wages for Housework is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and it's not true that it was a campaign that ended in the 70s. We are still alive and kicking. And again, the symposium here is interested in care as a potentially transformative and disruptive practice. And we agree that valuing care work would put the care and reproduction of people at the center and transform society. And if anybody doubts this, you can look to the quote in the pamphlet by Selma James in 1972, where the demand for wages for housework was put forward to the Manchester Women's Liberation Conference. And it says, let them pay us, or else we can go to the factories and offices and put our children in their fathers' laps. Let's see if they can make Ford cars and change nappies at the same time. So briefly, I'll just speak about how, wages for housework has been mischaracterized in a lot of academia and even by trade unions. And that is the pretense that, the Wages for Housing campaign ended in the 70s. And it is to some extent to hide the work of Selma James and to hide the work that we've been doing over the past 50 years, campaigning at the grassroots. So we agree that valuing and centering care will basically transform the entire economic and class relation and basically seeks to undermine capitalism. But we do not agree that sex work is exclusive and pointing to new ways of rearranging social relations that provide alternatives to our current understandings of solidarity and care. This risks sensationalizing or glamorizing sex work and making it an exception when it really is not. So I will just end by reading this poem called For Selma James that was written by a poet, Khadija Ruth, from her book Housework. Yeah, it was written in celebration of our 50th anniversary. So the poem goes like this. For Selma James. Why were women so angry with Selma James? All she said was, imagine if housework were paid. They say she burned with a strange fever. Classy women rolled their eyes when she spoke. They dismissed her, this work done for love, somehow discounted, not seen as toil, but viewed as a role accompanied by bluebirds and a soprano, maybe a rainbow, but no pot of gold. I'll wager, if housework were noted, more women could choose and caring would have currency. Not taken for granted, maybe men might respect the share. And those with less wouldn't need to clean middle-class houses ahead of their own. We hold half of heaven. We could speak in voices, take time away. Thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of the classes this morning. We will open it up for discussion, questions. So the format we'll follow is we'll start with the questions in the room, which I will kind of keep track of, and then Yeah, Niina is going to keep track of the questions online. So those of you who are online, just bear with us. So once we have the questions, sorry.
I have a question. No, I was just put my hand.
Okay, yeah. Okay, those of you who are online, just bear with us. So we'll first address the questions in the room and then, of course, address the questions online. And as Niina had mentioned before, and Sharmila too, is you can post your questions in the chat and Niina is going to keep track of that. Okay, so we have the first question. If you don't mind stating your name and
There might be a, yeah.
yeah, that is the mic. That's portable.
I think you can speak from anywhere in the room.
Oh, okay, cool. So interesting. Thank you. This question is mainly for the ECP, but I guess, for the whole panel as well. Which speaks to what you said, Charlotte, about how advocating for rights for sex workers means that we can turn down other work. And it reminded me of something that Heather Berg said, who I know is speaking later today. And Heather Berg was talking about how in Texas, it became illegal for strippers under the age of 21 to work. And that happened at the same time that there was an employment crisis in the hospitality industry. So it was this like real legislative push to make sure that you were under the age of 21, you were no longer allowed to strip, you had to go work in a bar or a restaurant for arguably just as exploitative conditions, but a fraction of the money as well. So yeah, but I wondered, because I agree that I'm also hostile to this idea that sex work is care work, but how do you think is the best way to, if not unionize and collectively work? Because the problem with nothing about us without us is that the us in that is very messy. There are lots of sex workers who, in order to feel legitimate as workers, go, no, this is a social good. I am doing something, this is an important thing to do. So what, as a sex worker grassroots organization, what do you think is the best way of collectively working, even though you are understandably hostile to this idea that sex work is care work, that actually sex work is work? It doesn't matter that it's providing a social good. We're doing it in order to provide for our families. Does that question make sense as a question? Yeah.
If I speak from here, will people hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you really point to something that I wanted to comment on anyway, which is, some people sometimes ask, what's the purpose of criminalizing sex work? I mean, public attitudes have changed a lot, particularly among younger generations of women. There's not the same kind of morality. There's not the same kind of view of that it's a degrading occupation. But yet criminalization is held onto by the authorities in a very forceful way. And it has to be that criminalization prevents women refusing the other, puts you in a weaker position to refuse the other exploitative jobs in exactly the way you have described very graphically between the strippers and the other bar work and the rest of it. And that has to be the reason that criminalization has been so forcefully imposed on sex workers, but it also is the reason why decriminalization does have to be a core strategy. I know Prabha, first of all, we have to say we do appreciate the fact that you've actually given a platform to the Wages for Housework campaign and to this event, of course, to comment on what Charlotte said. But I wouldn't want what you said to be interpreted as that we have to make a choice between demanding decriminalization or not, and demanding benefits and rights and resources, because it's not a choice. I mean, both things have to happen. And when we first started in 1975, we were different from what was going on at the time, really, and even some of the other sex workers organizations that started after us, in that we always demanded both things. We said we want decriminalization because we have to get the laws off our back. We have to be given the status of other exploited and abused workers. It's not that we think that decriminalization is going to be the panacea and that we're going to somehow enter some utopian kind of society, but we will suffer the discrimination and exploitation that other workers suffer, and that will be an improvement. But also we would find out who sex workers are. I mean, my feeling about criminalization and the burden that it imposes on us is that it does two things. First and foremost is that it makes it easier to hide who sex workers are. It makes it harder for other people, starting with other women, to identify with us, and it stops us getting together in collective ways that you described, Dee. So I feel like the decriminalization has to be a foundational demand. But of course, we do also want to demand resources in order to leave sex work when we want, because otherwise you are cornered in an area where you are then ending up justifying or defending sex work, and you don't want to do that. You don't want to say, you know, I mean, nobody would ask that of a whole set of other workers. But sex workers are more often asked to defend our job or asked whether we like our job than other people, and we don't want to be in that position, because we are part of the working class movement to work less for more money, and we don't want, you know, that has been a split in the left between demanding the right to work and demanding the right to work less. And we're definitely on the side of demanding the right to work less. So I think that that's one of the things I wanted to comment on. I just wanted to comment on, I liked what you said, Julia, but I didn't agree only that demanding recognition, or so that care work reproduces hierarchies. Of course it does. But it also is fundamentally a anti-capitalist strategy. You know, valuing care work, I suppose, is an anti-capitalist strategy, because it starts with the premise that our lives matter. And that is really the basis of an anti-capitalist struggle, because, of course, in a capitalist system, the last thing that matters is our lives. And so I just wanted to comment on that as well, because I feel like that's the reason that when we first started as a sex worker organization, it was really useful that we started as an autonomous organization within the Wages for Housework campaign, not only because it was a massive protection, because at that time the stigma and discrimination was such that nobody could be public. You know, we couldn't even speak on a platform like this. We hadn't yet worked out a strategy of not saying who was and who wasn't working, which is what we did for many, many decades. You know, when people asked us, are you a sex worker? We'd say, well, we don't say, and left it like that. And that was a protection. And by that time, that was how we found a way of speaking in our own right. But to begin with, we literally had to depend on non-sex workers being our spokeswomen. And so being part of the Wages for Housework campaign in that way was a big protection. And we also benefited from that orientation, and it has guided us ever since. And it is the reason that you know, by valuing life and demanding that the work of caring is valued, and that human life is put at the center of society, it helped us a lot, because it meant that we didn't fall into what we call the kind of happy hooker kind of ideology, where you are forced to defend the value of sex work in order to justify your demand for rights. And so, you know, it's kind of, we've followed that path, and it's been very helpful, because it's also always meant that we've been rooted in a working class experience.
Okay, so Julia, did you want to respond till we?
Only to agree with exactly about that. Yeah, decolonization. Well, it's a bit like migration, that you get these kind of occasionally libertarian, no border. But if you're not also for against policies that give people no recourse to public funds, you know, and just being able to come and do a shit live on here rather than somewhere else. So it's like they're working in tandem, but at the same time as we're getting rid of decriminalisation, if you stop the state from stop state violence, stopping immigration control, which is a way of trying to pull back. So I completely agree about that, and also the point that Victoria made about pushing people out of, trying to stop people from having it. Because I guess the thing about sex work is that because it's very difficult for capital to kind of come in and truly proletarianize your body in that way. And so there's a fugitive quality of sex work that you can actually take it in you, but you can go anywhere and do it. So you can kind of see why those controls would be imposed to prevent women from, well, just, prevent anybody from taking advantage of those kinds of opportunities for independent economic survival rather than. So I agree with that. And with care work, just back on that, I didn't mean to say that I thought care work was always hierarchies, just that it can be, and that if it's poorly defined, or at least how do we say, do you know what I mean? What is necessary? Like what one person thinks is necessary to being cared for, even an elderly person. Sometimes they're reproducing, very privileged person in certain ways, making them do things that it can reproduce servile relations in care work as well as what I true care. So I suppose that's what I meant. Less bound.
Thank you. Questions in the room? Niina, maybe we can start.
Yeah, there's Doris Murphy who wants to pose a question.
We've unmuted her.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you for the talks. And I'm looking forward to talking tomorrow. And I'm sad I'm not there, Sharmila, because I know we were hoping I might be there. Sorry, I missed the first talk, but just in response to the whole discussion around care and social reproduction, I attended a talk by Sarah Faris on Tuesday with LSE in the III. And she was talking about maybe a good distinction might be that kind of social reproduction is explaining why things are the way they are now, and that maybe care is kind of more that like utopian or imagining a better future might be a way of kind of explaining a lot of the theories and the writing that has been done. And I suppose for me, and as trying to think about it in sex work, that might kind of be where your decrim and harm reduction and proper services is the work of what we can do now in social reproduction type stuff and thinking about that framing, but actually proper societal care for one another, proper affective relations, all of the choices, all of the things that we want in the bigger, broader utopian sense, where nobody has to do anything they don't want to, that's the very forward-looking one. And so maybe my question is, I don't know, yeah, why can't people see that obviously? And I think, I'm not saying any of you in particular, but I think people get caught up in the little bits of the legislation, whereas I think Niki put it so well that that's just a step. And so maybe why don't people think more broadly about, we're trying to move to this beautiful, caring future. These are the obvious, easy steps to start. And so that's to all of you as a discussion point.
Would anybody like to start?
Well, I think, if I understand it, it's a bit like, I mean, what I like about the demand for wages for housework or for a care income now or for a living wage for mothers and other carers is that it shows, it helps to reveal the work, and it provides a direction and an intention. I mean, I remember we were having a discussion about wages for housework right at the very beginning. And I remember Selma said that somebody said to her, I'm really not sure whether housework is socially reproductive or socially useful work in a Marxist sense. I think it was socially useful. I'm sorry, I find it difficult to follow some of the, to keep my terms right. But somebody sort of said to her, I really don't know if it really is, really socially useful work in a Marxist sense. And she said, I don't care. She said, women want the money, and that's what's important. And I think that's what it often comes down to, is that you're expressing an intention, you're expressing a direction, you're expressing a demand. And in the course of that, you're, bringing people together. And one of the first things that happens when women start to speak about their unwaged work is that you do get a different sense of your own worth and your own sense of entitlement. And that has a ripple effect. And we have no idea what that does and how that in fact transforms society in the course of transforming society. So I think that's what you're saying is it, or you're asking us to comment on, is how do these demands kind of like help us in terms of where we're trying to go and how we're trying to understand the world we live in and our place in it. So I hope that helps.
I mean, just to add to that, I mean, our sister Liz from Empower has been here, and then she reflected this little anecdote because so Liz is from Empower, but they're building a human rights defenders collective in Thailand, which includes a lot of women from different sectors. So, for example, the women who live in the slums, some environmental lawyers, and a lot of other different groups. And when they got together and talked about caring and about our demand for care income, one of the ladies who they've known for years got slightly emotional and said this was the first time in her life, even though she's been organizing for so long, where she was asked to reflect about the work that she does as a mum. And the fact that we are still doing the survey, what do mothers and carers want, really points to very blatant gaps in, especially even within organizing, right? Yeah.
Thank you. And I totally agree with everything that you're saying, because I think the gap, and I think that's why this panel is so beautiful, because there's such a gap, obviously, in so many ways to me as an observer, between academic theorizing, being here, maybe, I won't say up or down, and reality check, etc., and lived experience being here. And it's about bringing them together rather than trying to say one is more, because, a good theory can help us do really good practice if it's a kind and caring one. So I think you're showing that so perfectly. And I totally love, who cares about Marx? Long dead.
No, don't say, oh my God, don't repeat that. Someone would, no, don't. She loves Marx and she follows Marx, and Marx is definitely at the root of much of the Wages for Housework campaign. She was saying she didn't care about the debate about the theory at that moment in time because and it was a particular moment in time. It was a moment in time where many of the left organizations really ganged up on the demand for wages for housework and absolutely, went out to destroy it because it stood against their basic principles of the right to work and the fact that the unions were central to all organizing in society. And so, what Selma was addressing was the fact that, you say it in this forum and people go absolutely crazy and oppose you, but when you go out not out onto the street, it's a cliche, but you go out into a community and say, what about wages for housework? And you go, oh yeah, that's a good idea. That's what I want. It's a bit like it cuts through all the debate about whether it's this or that or the other. It's like women understand that it's a leverage of power to improve their situation right there and build their sense of entitlement and, and it's a demand that people can come together on. So it was that kind of thing. Sorry, I don't want to be misinterpreted that she was thinking that Marx didn't matter.
In Selma James' book, Sex, Race and Class, Marcus Rediker wrote the preface, and he says the Wages for Housework campaign, instead of putting theory into practice, puts practices into theory, which I think is very good.
have one more question. I kind of summarized it. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'll go to Marna. Marna.
Yeah, let's do the audience.
Let's do the audience one.
Okay. So we do have Marna with a question. So Marna.
I don't know if it's a question. It's more of just thinking through some of the fascinating discussions that's happening here. As a researcher who's very much an outsider to the community that I work with, when I was doing my research with sex workers in India, even though I grew up in the city, I'd never really been to the red light area because, you know, for many different reasons. And what struck me was how much care was happening between the women in the red light area. And I'm hoping that I'll be able to touch upon that in my paper later. But just thinking about like these questions, you know, how can the kind of theoretical apparatus of care work be useful towards collectivizing and bringing together sex workers who disagree on their stance of sex work and what it does for them and to their lives and relation to society. And I'm wondering, instead of talking so much about what sex work and sex workers do for society, maybe we can use that as a way to talk about what sex workers do for each other in their community, and illuminate. And I think as allies, as academics, you know, maybe it's our responsibility to illuminate these instances of care and mutual aid practices, which have become so important in the context of the pandemic. And you know, maybe that can be a tool of mobilizing, where we're talking about, you know, this is a community that is marginalized but is caring for each other in these incredible ways. And I'm thinking about simple things like, you know, we've talked about simple things like, you know, cooking for each other, looking after each other, you know, protecting each other from violence from families in different ways. And I'll talk about that in my paper as well. And maybe we need to talk a little bit more about that rather than, you know, I think it is important to talk about, you know, the sex work and its place within society and what it does in terms of, you know, providing care for and socially productive labor to, say, clients, for example, but also what the sex workers do for each other. And I think especially in this country, you know, with the laws around kind of the fact that sex workers can't be in the same brothel together, but they are. I mean, people are supporting each other and protecting each other, and maybe that could be useful in kind of, I don't know, just illuminating the solidarity and care that's taking place in the community already. I don't know if it's a question or a question.
I mean, I think what you're describing is the work that women do for each other. I don't think we should, you know, make a special case. I think it, you know, the danger is that it can become, I'm patronizing is a strong word, but danger is it can be patronizing if you sort of say this is what sex workers are doing for each other, because number one, that's what women are often doing for each other. And also sometimes it's not what we're doing for each other. Sometimes we're in competition with each other, and sometimes we're shafting each other, and sometimes we're undermining each other. But that's not really the point. The point is that's what may be going on within personal and individual relationships. But what strategy do you have, or what orientation do you have, for example, as a sex worker organization? And our point has always been that we start with the situation of women who are working on the street, the situation of migrant and trans women who face the most discrimination, the most police abuse, and that in doing that, exactly, that we get to everybody, because, and we've always had that as a really basic principle. That was one of our founding principles, that we have to start with the situation of women with least power who are facing the worst impact of criminalization, and in doing so get to everyone, rather than do what some organizations have done in the past, which is only deal with inside workers or you know, a particular sector of sex workers. And I think the fact that we are one of the longest standing sex worker organizations, and that was always our founding principle, has actually been helpful for the rest of the movement. And we face it all the time. You know, you're organizing a campaign about some particular injustice, and some women will come along and sort of say, well, you know, I'm not like her. And you just have to deal with it. You have to say that is not what we stand for. We are not going to be divided in that kind of way. But that's really in terms of your campaigning. I mean, outside of your campaigning, we are just like everyone else. You know? Sometimes we're good, sometimes we're really not so good.
I mean, absolutely, I completely agree with you, Niki, and I apologize if I came across as patronizing. I think
I wasn't a criticism of you. It's just that, you know, that thing.
No, absolutely, you can. I mean, and I think I come from a point where I'm actually saying that if we illuminate these instances of care and competition, and we show that the community is heterogeneous and diverse, and, you know, people have different experiences, but they still kind of find different ways to care for each other. But in many ways, it allows us to draw links with women who are not sex workers as well. And in that sense, we are not exceptionalizing this community by saying there's some sort of model of care or competition, but we're saying that, their realities are very human, just like everyone else's. And therefore, if we're talking about choice and agency and exploitation, then we need to link it to other experiences that happen to women who are not sex workers as well. So it's just very, very kind of preliminary thoughts, but I'm very much in agreement with you that we need to kind of stop this kind of exceptionalizing of experiences.
I think you're right. I think you're on the right track in terms of that's what we want to do. But I think that, for example, the demand of the sex worker rights movement that sex work is work, and the demand to end the criminalization, and the demand to the entitlement to the same resources as other people is a clearer way of doing it.
Absolutely.
Because there is a danger in what you say that, as soon as you sort of say, yes, it's not just care, it's also competition. Even though I said it myself, I kind of go, whoa, let's not get into that, because, that's also, I can't tell you how many times you're dealing with NGOs or health kind of projects or outreach projects, and they always kind of tell you with this kind of salacious kind of interest, the women don't like each other, the street workers are completely different from the women inside. And you're kind of going, so what? That's not your business.
Yeah.
Leave us to deal with that. That's not your business. Yeah. And they like to, and the purpose of that is really to impose themselves, to show that we actually need them to, I don't know, whatever, provide the services, bring us together, whatever, and hostility is definitely what I feel.
We can go to, I think Charlie will come back to you. I think there is a question online. So we'll come back.
I will just read out 2 comments and then a question. The first comment is from Letitia Sabse, who's actually teaching at the Gender Studies Department. So Letitia says, Niki, Charlotte, I cannot agree more with you. As someone with experience working as an ally with the Sex Workers Union in Argentina, I see how important and great the work is the work that ECP has been doing for years. So in solidarity. From Doris, Maggie O'Neill speaks about biographies of difference, but finding the similarities, such as care or justice, as a way of bringing us together, and included a link there. And here is one question that I've summarized, directed at Prabha, and I think anyone can also answer, which is, beyond the legal reform, how do we get the police and legal administrative authority to be more sympathetic? And I think they need in actual contact, street level bureaucrats. How do we make them more accountable? And I guess I'm going to tack onto that. Is that a project that we are invested in? Can we think that can be done?
I think that's already happening, right? I did talk about the Supreme Court orders, but in order to implement those orders, we need to actually have mobilization on the ground. And in fact, if you look at the orders the Supreme Court passed, actually they were complied with in particular states of the country. And it's no surprise that those are the states where the sex workers movement was the strongest, which made sure that the orders were actually being implemented. So I think there's no question. And I think sex workers groups know this very, very well, that they are able to go up and down the so this goes to the question of the state. The state is actually a very disparate entity, right? There's a judiciary. Within the judiciary, we have a case on the trafficking bill, we have a case on, decriminal. Both of them just sit there, and the question is, what are the rules of the law that decide which trumps the other? But I think the executive also is highly differentiated in certain states. In India, it's common in certain states for the topmost police heads to desist from enforcing the Immoral Traffic Prevention Act against sex workers. So there is just de facto, there's an understanding, or there's a circular that's issued to say, do not arrest women under Section 8. So I think it's all a function of how much the local groups are able to mediate with, the police who come in on it, and they keep moving on a regular basis. The question is that the groups that are there, can they negotiate this? And I think they've left no stone sort of unturned. They've gone to human rights commissions, they go to courts, they go to basically bureaucrats up and down the chain, so to speak.
Just wanted to add one thing to Prabha's. Also, at least with Bubar, we've seen a lot of interpersonal relationships. They invest heavily on that. Yeah. So with police officers and the police headquarters everywhere, this is this is truly, I mean, I would characterize it as a trust relationship, because if there's a case and a woman got, detained, they can actually show up to the specific officer to say like, this wasn't the right thing to do. That was.
And I just want to add also, Durbar also, and I think in some parts, even in Maharashtra, I think the ability of sex workers to say, I think in a lot of developing countries where the resources, you have state capacity issues. I think if there is a vacuum, I think sex workers groups themselves self-regulate, right? So the idea that you can have a self-regulatory group that deals with trafficking in a red light area, it requires certain conditions in which to be improved and for its success. But I think that is also possible. And then you have this very interesting division of labor between the police and then the local groups. So the police will intervene only if there is a minor who's been trafficked in the sense that we think of deception, so on and so forth, from a rural part of it. So then there's a very interesting hierarchy then that's set up within these spaces. But there's the biggest myth, and this is where I want to go to the question of decriminalization. I think what I mean to say is that under the criminal law, which is sometimes enforced, sometimes not enforced, there's a vast number of social norms, actors playing with each other, right? They're repeat actors, they're interacting with each other. In law, we call this legal pluralism. The question is, if you need an accounting for how these norms work, how these customs work, so in fact, I would argue in large parts of India, we have de facto decriminalization, right? Because the law is never really implemented for all sorts of reasons, or is implemented opportunistically, right? And then you have to push back. So that's what I mean. I think, if we have this space of de facto decriminalization, how are we using it to then think beyond the criminal law, but also while resisting it? I completely agree with you. It's a necessary condition. It's not sufficient to decriminalize. But given that, and this case is a perfect example where this is so contentious, illegal status of sex work. I mean, I would say the Supreme Court is saying we cannot wait forever. Sex workers' dignity cannot wait forever till we resolve this fundamental elephant in the room. Should sex work be legal or not? I think that's the most powerful thing that the government, the state is actually saying. Just look to the Constitution. That is going to guide how we treat each other. Even if the government doesn't want to decriminalize sex work.
And it's a really important step towards decriminalization.
Yes,
because you're
absolutely.
a whole set of other.
You're peeling away slowly, right? I think it's very important. The interplay between the laws here is also very interesting. The Constitution always trumps any other sort of other law, right?
Yeah.
It's subordinate to the Constitution. So,
No, it's really good, and I really agree with you that it comes down to the campaigning and the mobilization. Because I think if you also asked that question about the police or from some other sector, like how can you get them to be better when they're doing stop and search, the answer. For us, even as a sex workers organization, the Black Lives Matter movement made a massive impact. For the first time, between that and the kind of outpouring of grief and fury after the death of Sarah Everard, in particular, it really changed the terrain with the police. It changed the terrain for us when we were speaking publicly about the abuse and threats and bullying and illegality and sexism and racism that we face from the police on a day-to-day level that has been covered up and hidden, starting by health projects and outreach projects who are often working very closely in partnership with the police and therefore have a vested interest in trying to present the police like social workers somehow when they come to dealing with sex workers. And suddenly the terrain completely changed, so that when we said, look, this is our experience of the police, people kind of go, oh yeah, that's right, rather than try and shout us down or say it's just a couple of bad apples. And so, the campaigning is what makes a difference. The strength of the movement is what makes a difference. And it also makes a difference, as you're describing, in what kind of orders we get and whether they're implemented or not. Because, we don't think we're going to get decriminal. If we had a law on decriminalization and they passed it, in this moment in time, with the hostile immigration environment as it is, and with the increased destitution and poverty, what kind of law would it be? That's not what's going to get us what we need.
Can we take two last questions and then we wrap it up? So we take the questions together and then answer. So you have one question? Yeah. And then there's one from the online audience.
Hello, my name is Jolly Ghosh and I'm from Department of Gender Studies. And I have so many questions, but I'll ask one. There is this hot debate usually on whether reproductive labor performed by homemakers, whether it should be paid or not paid, because there are so many moral, like womanhood and motherhood and all such things are attached to, women. So it makes like, how can you pay your mother, or how can you, pay your sister for, what they are doing for you? So there are these moral notions are also, attached to it, which makes the debate very complicated. So if we talk about the sexual labor, in this sense, do you think whether sexual labor should be paid or not in a very moral realm of marriage, inside a marriage, and if it is, I mean, maybe it is very stereotypical, or let's say a husband is paying his wife, so isn't it a very paternalistic idea of, paying in this sexual labor? I don't know whether this question makes sense.
I will have another question from Katie, and then I'll give it to the panel. So Katie, you can unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay, hi everybody. First of all, just thank you to everybody for some wonderful discussions and some really interesting points. My question is kind of for everybody, but specifically in the second talk, apologies that I struggled a bit with my sound, so I think I kind of dipped in and out, so if it was already answered, I do apologise. But there was a point about I think the Care Manifesto overstating the role of neoliberal capitalism. Now, I'm really interested in kind of the impact of neoliberalism in my own work, and obviously not obviously, but I am working from a UK perspective, and we've already kind of heard about how things like, the decimation of the welfare state and lack of government support during the pandemic, and has created this need for, amongst other things, the mutual aid that we've seen throughout the pandemic. But at the same time, I'm really interested in also kind of I'm happily acknowledging that obviously neoliberalism isn't the same in every kind of different locale. So I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more to this kind of like this overstatement on neoliberalism, and whether that is perhaps more like a locale specific thing, whether neoliberalism's effects are different, if that's maybe something to consider, if that makes sense. I'm sorry.
I think, Johnny, I'm not sure if you're referring to the kind of debates you had in India around payment of women's work, but I think it's a question of, how does one pay a mother? I mean, obviously the altruistic work that she's doing, can you put a price on it? I think it's a very question that Julia was asking, can you really ever measure it, and, if a very wealthy woman is just introducing, throwing parties to which she gets, her husband gets some, corporate deals. I mean, is that really what we should be paying? So I think I'm thinking of it. I think the answer to the question depends on, who's paying for it and how it is being paid. So I think, and there is a huge range in terms of, certainly in the Indian context, the conversation has been around the state's payment. I mean, there was a proposal for husbands to pay, and I think that conversation needs to be kept alive, because in India we don't have a matrimonial property regime. So, you could go through your entire life contributing to the life of the household. But even if you were to get, at the point of exit from a marriage, you'd have absolutely nothing to take. What you came in with is probably what you leave with. And even getting maintenance is a huge hurdle, where actually there's some very fascinating work. If you look at the case law, there is a certain expectation that you have to perform reproductive labor. Those are the terms on which you get married. So I've heard women often say, when you ask them this question, you want to get paid for work? They say, yes, we're already getting paid. I mean, the husband is taking care of my needs within the marriage. He's paying for my upkeep. Right? So that's your starting point. So it's a very tricky starting point to start from, where even women don't value the kind of work that they do. So we have a long way to go. But I think there are ways in which you can if the state is paying, you can curtail how the state pays for it, or rather the state itself will. Often the state cannot pay everyone for it. So there is an issue around fiscal deficits. It's actually the care income is a very interesting conversation. The question is, how do you pay this? Where does the money come from? It's what every state would ask. And sometimes that's mediated by having a whole range of criteria. What is your annual income? And it turns out that states will pay the weakest, the people who are the most weakest sections of society. And the reality is those are the very women who are anyway having to go out to work. Right, so this kind of income, this kind of gendered basic income, as you might call it, can kind of assist them. And I think on the question of sexual labor, it's very interesting. Again, here I think, and I can only speak to the Indian context. We are starting with a very interesting debate on marital rape nowadays, right? Which is an expectation there, the way that the judges have talked. I mean, we've had a split decision recently on marital rape in India, where one judge says the immunity for marital rape, which was read out of the law in the UK in 1991. Actually, there should be an immunity for the husband because the husband is along a different track in this economy, sexual economy, right? And so the expectation in the Indian context seems to be that it's a duty to perform, to have sexual relations. Similarly with domestic work, it's a duty. So for divorce, often, the grounds for cruelty, right, as a ground of divorce is often that the woman wasn't making tea for me, she wasn't doing unpaid work. So our starting point is somewhere, so problematic that. I think it would be quite hard to answer that question in terms of recognition of sexual labor. I think just the right to bodily autonomy is something that we need to make first. Again, I don't think that's a solution. I don't think, holding men responsible for marital rape is enough, but, at all. But you have to first establish that before we can really think about, sexual labor. But there have been housewives in Calcutta actually who said, when sex workers were asking for, there was a short period when the mayor of Calcutta said, we will give licenses to sex workers. And there was a housewife who wrote in the newspaper saying that, if she can get, a license, I would like a license too, because actually it's the homemaker. So at the bottom, if you thought sex workers were like the litmus test for whether a society is caring or actually turns out to be that unpaid, homemakers are the worst off in a certain sense. So I think also the question of neoliberal capital, I think I was just trying to say that, I don't want to say that, the effects of neoliberal capitalism are very real. I mean, you just have to, I just view it somewhat as a lawyer in the sense that I think you have to map out precisely which contracts are you talking about. Are you talking to contracts to mask makers or to government? Like, where exactly is the corruption? I think you have to think about neoliberal capitalism in that way. And I really think it's very context specific. So, it's very context specific, it's very situation specific. You have to be exactly able to point out where neoliberal capitalism is working. But I think as somebody who studies, and I think that none of us would agree, neoliberal capitalists are very illuminating for people on the ground, because you see so many different, and I'm sure in the UK, you see so many different layers of the way that capital organizes our lives and how we step out of capital, that I'm just wary of it as a concept with which to do empirical work or even good theoretical work. But I think definitely as a lawyer, I think it's a very productive thing to pass out the various kinds of contracts that really go to corporations with no accountability whatsoever. I mean, in the trafficking domain, certainly, it's been documented by ethnograpers that the big companies that rely on body work, right, people who do contractual precarious work, want to isolate trafficking as an issue of sex trafficking in Thailand or in India, whereas in fact they don't want to, they maintain workers on very precarious terms within their own country. So that is neoliberal capital for you, exporting the problem. So I think it exists, but I think the problem with the care manifesto is because it's talking about care in this very broad sense, and then goes on to show the mutual aid. All of us, I think, tried to sew gowns or masks or whatever, during the pandemic. So it was very clear that we have the capacity to care. And I think overstating this thing that neoliberalism just sucks the life out of you is also an overstatement, because we've shown that the very same nurses who went over and above were not paid, right? I mean, they were not paid their pay rise. And I think recently also, once the report has come over the lockdown violations, I think every day there's a photo of the janitors who were cleaning, in 10 Downing, who died, very soon after the pandemic started. So, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say something in response to the question about sexual labor. I don't think that's where we should start. I don't think we should start with the kind of confusing and, you know, difficult questions, because I think it's better to start with the very straightforward issue that women themselves are raising. Why not let's start with paying mothers for the work of raising children and the money to come from the state? And the money is definitely there. I mean, you know, they could cancel Trident if they, you know, that would help. And, you know, and I think that's one of the things that sex workers have been able to contribute is that, you know, we can say we've seen the money. Don't tell us there's no money. We've seen it. You know, we see the billionaires and the millionaires and all the rest of it. And so, you know, don't try and pull the wool over our eyes. And if you start, I mean, it doesn't address the whole issue, but if you start by paying mothers for the work of raising children, for the money to come from the state, and then let's see what other demands women are raising. And on the GWS, on the Global Women's Strike website, there is a really brilliant video from Thailand, which is part of the Women Human Rights Collective that Charlotte spoke about. And it's women in all these different situations, from the slum communities, from the women organizing against the pollution caused by gold, mining for gold, and all farming communities, people reclaiming the land. And they are talking about the work that they're doing, caring for people and the planet, and say, why not pay us? And they found a way to pay the people that are destroying the environment. So why not pay the people that are protecting the environment? You know, it's like, it's not that complicated once you've had that shift in, and once women are making their demands, saying this is useful work, caring work for society, that improves society, that defends people's health and, you know, well-being. Why am I not being paid for it? And then I think that kind of will cut through a lot of questions. And if women start demanding work, payment for sexual labor, okay, we'll have to consider it. I mean, look, what can you do? Sorry, financial independence. It's true what, you know, about between the family, but the fact is that some women also want money, not just for the work of caring for children, but work within, for the work that they do within the family, because even if they're getting some money from their husband, not financial independence. And financial independence gives you the power to refuse all kinds of shit.
Okay, this brings us to the end of the keynote panel, and thank you to all the speakers for your contributions, a lot to think about. And thank you to all in the audience, both online and in the group. Questions? So, when is the next panel meeting?
So let's just come back by 12.
Come back by 12. Okay, so we're reconvening